Well, thank you very much, Rabbi, for those kind words. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be asked to speak to your synagogue this evening, to your members of your community. I'm only sorry I can't be there in person. Hopefully, after we get through the COVID nightmare, the Rabbi will be kind enough to invite me to come and meet you in person, which would be a real pleasure to do. I know you're all multimillionaires up there in Hampstead, so yeah, I can pass the hat around a bit as well and hope for a few checks put in there. But no, in all seriousness, it is a pleasure to be with you. I'm here in Tel Aviv at the moment. I've been in Israel for a number of days, and I've been traveling to meet a number of IDF officers and government officials and politicians, because I've come here to carry out a preliminary investigation of the Gaza conflict on behalf of a group that I'm a member of called the High Level Military Group. And the High Level Military Group is made up of about 15 or so retired generals, mainly former chiefs of staff, in other words, the heads of their armed forces from countries including the UK, US, Canada, Australia, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, India, and some South American countries as well, and other countries. And in due course, they will come, and some of those members will come over here, I hope, when we can arrange it. It's very difficult, as you know, to travel here at the moment, and write a more comprehensive report. And the purpose of this is to employ our military expertise. I served in the British Army for 30 years, and some of the other members of the group served for longer in their national armed forces, and reached much higher ranks than I did. And the purpose is to provide ammunition to counter some of the horrific propaganda that we will undoubtedly see in the United Nations, in the EU, among human rights groups, in the media, at universities and elsewhere. And you know, most of this is, as I'm sure you're well aware, is deeply uninformed information. And so the work that my group and I hope to do will try and redress that balance to an extent. Now, I appreciate it's actually quite limited, because generally speaking, people don't want to know this. They only want the bad news about Israel. They only want to hear that Israel's an apartheid state, that it's been murdering children gratuitously. That's what they want to know. They don't want to know the reality, but nevertheless, they're going to be told the reality. And I would expect that not only will we speak at the United Nations, but also, as we have done in the past, we will speak in Congress, at the British Parliament, the French-German parliaments, and other government organizations, to try and make sure at least those legislators who are willing to listen are given the facts as they are, and not as the media and other anti-Israel organizations would like to do. I'm going to speak because my favorite subject is myself. I'm a very arrogant person. I love talking about myself. So I'm going to talk a bit about myself, and then I'm going to speak a little bit about the current conflict over here. And I apologize, I'm sure most of you have been following it very avidly. But I'll update you on some of the impressions I've received being over here. And then speak maybe a bit more broadly about some of the other challenges that we face, and happy to take questions after that. If somebody could, maybe Rabbi, if you can flick the camera off when I become too boring, because not only do I like talking about myself, but I also love the sound of my own voice. So I know that's a trait that's common among rabbis, obviously current people are not included in that, but I don't want to take up too much of your time boring you with my meanderings. But before I do that, I just really wanted to express my personal sympathy, is probably the wrong word, but outrage, I suppose, is probably a better word, at what's been going on in the UK, in London, and including in your area in the last number of days, weeks, triggered, or using the excuse of the Gaza conflict as a trigger to initiate some really very, very unpleasant Jew hate, or anti-Semitism, as the technical term goes. It's absolutely, and it doesn't need me to say this to this audience, but it's absolutely despicable that in 21st century Britain, questions should be asked like, should I wear my kippah? Should I put my mezuzah on the door that the rabbi mentioned? I mean, this is 1930s Germany. This is the early stages of the mid-1930s Germany. And it's totally, totally wrong that it should be happening here and now. And any one of us, whether we're Jews or non-Jews, who are in a position to stand up against it, obviously must do so without question. And I know many people, many people who are not Jews are also absolutely horrified by what's happening. So on to my favorite subject. I was in the British Army for 30 years, and in that time I fought in Northern Ireland on many occasions. Starting when I was 19 years of age, I was commanding a platoon in Belfast. And the last tour I did in Northern Ireland was in 1979. The last tour I did in Northern Ireland was in around about 2001. And I served there many times in that intervening period. And Northern Ireland actually is quite comparable to what the IDF is doing in the West Bank, not Gaza, but in the West Bank. It's a similar sort of situation, sometimes more intense, sometimes less intense. But I can understand what the IDF are having to deal with in Gaza through my experience in Northern Ireland. I also served in Afghanistan and Iraq on a number of occasions, the Balkans, and elsewhere in the Middle East. And in those conflicts, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq, we were fighting an enemy that is, the work there was very similar in many ways to what the IDF are doing in Gaza, have been doing in Gaza, particularly in the conflict in 2014 rather than today, where there was a land element as well. Obviously, as you know, that the current conflict involves really only air forces to the greatest extent, some others as well. And I've served with the United States forces, fighting alongside them, and various other national armies. I think the difference is between the British Army, the US Army, etc., and the Israeli Army is that we always fight side by side with allies. The Israelis fight on their own, and therefore when our actions are comparable and compared to the actions of other armies, and they're not seen as unique or unusual or special particularly, they're what many people are doing. The IDF's operations are seen in isolation because they always fight alone, obviously with assistance from and support from the United States in particular, other countries, including Britain, when it comes to certain, not fighting troops, but when it comes to intelligence and some technology assets, then, Britain and cyber, Britain does assist in some of those operations, but it's not the same. Israel fights in isolation, is looked at uniquely, and is branded in a way that our armies are not branded. That they are invariably, and we're going to see it, we've already seen the beginnings of it, we're going to see it now, a propaganda campaign inside the United Nations Human Rights Council aimed at not just vilifying Israel, but also dragging Israelis, soldiers, politicians, officials, into the dock at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And they've explicitly said already in the United Nations Human Rights Council that their objective is to collect legal evidence against Israel in order to indict Israeli soldiers. It's shameful, it's shocking, it's disgraceful. When you consider what we're talking about a conflict between a proscribed terrorist group, Hamas, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and others, and the army, the legitimate army of a democratic Western democracy. And there is no comparison. Yet even today, I saw a tweet from the Foreign Secretary, the British Foreign Secretary, calling on both sides to respect the ceasefire that's now in place. Now that to me is a shameful comment to make. Yes, he should call on Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad to observe the ceasefire, but he should not be making equivalent comments to the army of one of our closest allies, who we cooperate with to such a large extent in military terms and intelligence terms. And it really shows, I think, the bankruptcy of so much political thinking these days. And this is the kind of attitude that I think incites some of the abuse that you may have witnessed or be aware of in the UK. Because if the government is prepared to tacitly sort of accept that Israel, the IDF, has been behaving wrongly, and they haven't. I mean, obviously there are exceptions, there are mistakes, there are people that do bad things or wrong things in every army, but as an army, they haven't been behaving badly or wrongly. But I think a government that is not prepared to staunchly stick up for Israel and for the IDF and is prepared to compare them to terrorists, that provides fuel and ammunition for anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom. I wrote an article not long ago where I called on the government to take a similar attitude to Austria during this recent conflict, where was Britain trying to be even-handed. It's wrong to be even-handed if you're comparing a liberal democracy and a terrorist organization that declares its intention to annihilate that democracy. Whereas in Austria, the president of Austria flew the Israeli flag from the chancellery in Vienna to show solidarity with Israel. That's the kind of thing that should be going on, to shove it back at these people who want to use Israel's actions as an excuse for not just vilifying Israel, but for attacking Jews everywhere. And so that's our objective in this situation. The rabbi also mentioned, when he and I had a chat just before this, he mentioned that I visited my yeshiva. I'm one of the few Jews that has a yeshiva. It's called Yeshiva Har Etzion in Gush Etzion. And I like to say that it's my yeshiva. I consider it that. I've visited it many times and spoken to some of the young students and some of the rabbis there as well. And it is a fantastic organization. I spoke there yesterday, and many of them have either fought in the IDF, many of the students, or are going to as part of a program that this yeshiva takes part in. And there were quite a few British students there. There may be even people that you know personally at that yeshiva at the moment or have been there before. And I also spoke this afternoon to a group of lone soldiers in Tel Aviv, some of whom were from the UK, others from Australia, Canada, and numerous other countries around the world, who have come to fight in Israel for the state of Israel. And I have huge admiration for them. And again, I suspect that some of you may even have done it yourself. Others may know people, or your sons or daughters have done it or are going to do it. And I just have the utmost admiration for any young Jew who will travel across the world, go into what is effectively an alien culture in so many ways, Middle Eastern culture, and spend 2 years or whatever it might be of their life fighting for their religious, if nothing else, homeland. And so I think that is the kind of spirit that that I've certainly witnessed. I've been over here many times, and I witnessed that. I've met many lone soldiers including from the UK. And to be honest, they are very difficult to tell apart from British soldiers. They wear an odd uniform compared to ours. I mean, we think it's odd. But when you meet them, as many of you have, they're the same. They're the same as us. They're not people who want to go around killing babies or, knocking off innocent civilians. Of course, they're not, any more than British soldiers are. So this is one of the reasons I find it so offensive to hear this. And they're British, they're Australian, Canadian, but the Israelis are the same. They speak with a slightly different accent, but apart from that, it's a very, very similar mentality and outlook. And indeed, the IDF is based on the British Army. Just briefly, then, the conflict that, as I've spoken to many Israeli commanders in the last few days and got some impressions from them. One thing that strikes me, actually, not the conflict directly, but one thing that strikes me very, very starkly is the way in which Israel has smashed its way back, bounced back to normality. it's now what, 3-4 days, something like that, into the ceasefire, maybe a bit longer. You wouldn't think anything had happened here. They're back straight into normal life, and that's I think, a hugely admirable trait of Israel, that they are so resilient. Many of them have been spending days and nights on end in bomb shelters, and yet they're back. And of course, that's even without thinking about the COVID issues that have been going on over here as they have over there. I went into a restaurant in Tel Aviv a few years back, the day after it had been subject to a shooting attack by jihadists. People have been killed in there. The day after, it was back to normal as a restaurant. It was quite extraordinary. And I think that's, of course, any country that's been fighting for its survival since it was reformed back in 1948, I think is it's a necessity to live like that and to immediately put something like that behind them. But of course, it's not over. It's a pause in a cycle of hostility that I think will raise its head again before very much longer, possibly 2 years, maybe more, maybe a bit less. We'll see. But it's really, I think, highly creditable that they're back to normal. The IDF hit Hamas very hard in this latest conflict. In previous conflicts, they've built up slowly to very significant assaults on the Hamas. This time they went straight in the air, and they did some severe damage as a result of long-term planning, very careful collection of intelligence. And they really shocked Hamas, I think, when they hit them so hard so early on. It didn't stop Hamas firing missiles, they carried on doing it, but it certainly disrupted them and I think gave them immense pause for thought. And not just Hamas, but also the message sent by some of the actions the IDF took up into the north, into Lebanon, would certainly have given something to Hezbollah to think about when they consider whether or not to use their hundreds of thousands of missiles pointing at Israel. Just one example, and I think this is, I'm sure you're all well aware of it, but I was discussing it with one of the Israeli Air Force commanders who was responsible for planning the operation and flew a combat aircraft in the operation. I forget it was last Thursday or Thursday before, I'm losing slight track of time, but they launched a huge operation against the metro tunnel system, having previously mounted a most impressive deception operation, massing Israeli forces on the border with Gaza, which then triggered Hamas fighters to rush into the tunnels, which the IDF then bombed. They deployed 160 combat aircraft, attacking 150 targets with precision-guided missiles, known as JDAMs, in a small area in between 20 and 40 minutes. Now, that is no mean feat. I'm not sure the British Air Force have got 160 planes. That represents about half of what the Israeli Air Force have. And the Israeli Air Force commander that I spoke to told me that if they had needed to do, they could have used the whole lot. They could have used twice that number in a similar strike. But it is a masterpiece of coordination and planning. And it, the complexities are immense. I've been involved in coordination of air and ground forces in the past. Just to hit the right targets and avoid aircraft smashing into each other in such a small space in such a short time is impressive. But on top of that, of course, they deliberately targeted areas that would result in the absolute minimum of collateral damage, in other words, civilian deaths. And that included bombing roads, open roads, rather than more built-up areas, open roads under which the tunnels sometimes ran. So that was, I think, deeply impressive. We will see what this leads to. Now, the IDF's strategic plan was to deny Hamas of equipment, munitions, weapons, command posts, intelligence sources, to deny all that to them by bombing it, and also to psychologically deter Hamas from re-engaging in this type of operation. Not permanently, because no one believes here that it could be done permanently without actually destroying Hamas completely. And that could be done. And if anyone's interested in my thoughts on that, I'm happy to give those in any questions. But they did severe damage, and we'll see how how it unfolds. Of course, Hamas were armed by Iran, and funded by Iran, directed by Iran, and Iran will be very enthusiastic about pushing Hamas back onto the offensive if they need pushing as soon as possible. So, I don't think anyone's overly optimistic about a lengthy delay. Just a couple of quick points on the differences between this and previous conflicts. I mentioned the immense speed and force of the IDF's actions. On the Hamas side, they achieved something they haven't achieved previously in this conflict, which is they essentially lured or cajoled or persuaded or just asked the entire Palestinian community, and I don't mean everyone in the community, but all parts of the community, to get involved in attacking Israel. So it wasn't just from Gaza, it was also Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank attacking Israelis, IDF particularly, but also some civilians in some of the communities there, and in Israel proper, Israeli Arabs attacking their fellow Israeli Jews, which is the first time that's happened in 20 years, 2 decades, on that scale. And even as far up as some of the Palestinians in Lebanon who fired missiles from southern Lebanon, not Hezbollah, they didn't open fire, but some Palestinian jihadists up in Lebanon did. So it embraced the whole thing, and that was, I think, quite a worrying thing. And particularly worrying is the Israeli Arabs turning on Israeli Jews in the way they did. That, of course, was orchestrated by Hamas, who have spent years infiltrating and trying to persuade their compatriots inside Israel not to integrate, not to get involved in the political process, which that they were beginning to do in some cases, but to attack. And obviously that's a big problem for Israel to try and get to grips with in the coming weeks. I think it also raises the question of the next time there's a conflict of having an internal insurrection in Israel, much bigger than occurred now. Hamas have been encouraged by this. They've seen what is possible, and they will be working very hard to try and expand that if they possibly can. I think it's this conflict also, which, I'm sure you know, was triggered by an internal Palestinian power struggle when President Abbas of Fatah cancelled the long overdue Palestinian Authority elections, because he cancelled them because he feared he wasn't going to win and that Hamas would get the upper hand in the elections, whether they'd win completely or at least get much more power. He didn't want that, and who would want that? So he cancelled elections. And then there was Palestinian incited rioting in Jerusalem, which then led Hamas, in an effort to try and increase and consolidate their authority and their influence among the Palestinian community. They then used that violence as an excuse to portray themselves as the sole defenders of Jerusalem against a fictional Israeli onslaught, and fired thousands of missiles at Israel. So I think what that's done, it's reduced the prospect of a two-state solution, if there was ever going to be a two-state solution. Some people think it's the right thing, some don't think it's the right thing. Personally, I don't think it's very likely ever to happen, but this certainly reduced the chance, because the more influence Hamas have, for a start, politically, the much less prospect there is. You couldn't have a two-state solution where Hamas is a major player. You couldn't do it. It would be impossible. A prescribed terrorist group. And secondly, it will, I think, have again convinced Israelis of the foolishness of the possibility of handing over complete control of areas of Judea and Samaria to a terrorist entity, which would do exactly the same, I am certain, from that territory towards Israel as they have done from Gaza when the Israelis left Gaza. So I think those things and other elements combined make a two-state solution much less likely. For the future, I think, and I say this without confidence it will happen, but I'm saying it anyway, which is that future aid to Palestinian Authority in the West Bank should be conditioned very much on trying to change the political dynamic there. Abbas needs to go. He is part of the problem. He's not part of the solution. He has to go, and aid support to the people there need to try and help bring that about, to not to let Hamas in, but to try and encourage other Palestinian entities to gain more influence there, who might be more willing to solve the problem than to make it worse. And secondly, I think the aid that goes into Gaza, which will start flowing in very soon from various countries, particularly Qatar, and also other countries, that also, steps need to be taken by the international community to ensure that goes to reconstructing Gaza and to welfare and facilities for civilians. They're not into the pockets of Hamas terrorists or into reconstructing their war machine. That is very likely to happen. I don't think it's very likely that will be stopped, but it should be a primary goal. So really, that's my very brief overview of the conflict as it is at the moment. I think I just wanted to make a brief comment on, and I'm happy again to take this up in questions. Going back to the UK, and I include the US, Australia, and other countries in this. The people I feel most worried about are young Jews going to university, and I'm sure those of you who either you may be young Jews going to university or at university, or you may own a few young Jews who are going to university. But that it is going to be worse for them now. Definitely going to be worse for them. And there is a great temptation to bury your head, to take your keeper off, to not raise your voice. I think that is a big mistake. And I know it's, most students that go to university, Jews or otherwise, they want to learn the subjects they're studying. They want to have a good social life as well. I've had one daughter at university. And they don't want to be fighting a war. They don't want to be fighting politically, but they have to do it because otherwise the war won't be fought. And this cancer will gain even greater traction in the universities. And so I think, I've spoken at many universities. I get always protests when I go there. I get abuse. I get shouted at, screamed at, things thrown at me. I don't mind that. But then I'm in a different position because I go into a university, I confront that sort of stuff and I leave. Whereas a student obviously has then got to live with it for a lot longer. And it's not easy. I don't pretend it is. But my advice would be two things, really. One is to keep, for those people who are going to university or at university, to really study as much as you can, as much as your other studies will allow, really study this situation in the Middle East and keep fully abreast of it, because those people who are opposing them don't know anything about it. They have slogans, they chuck lines away. If you ask them to point out on a map where Israel is, where Gaza, they won't tell, they would no idea. I spoke at the United Nations Human Rights Council after every single conflict that Israel's been involved in over Gaza in emergency debates. And I listened to a lot of ambassadors from around the world pouring out anti-Israel vitriol. And during the breaks, I went and spoke to some of these ambassadors and I asked them what they meant by it, what that part of that speech meant. They couldn't tell me because they didn't know, because they're ignorant. They're happy to spew out the venom, but they can't back it up. It's slogans they've been told to say, it's speeches they've been told to deliver. And the same applies to most of the people who are anti-Israel at university. They can be countered. They can be countered by knowledgeable people who use logical, persuasive language. Now, I think that the main target is not the hardcore. The main target is not the pro-Israel people, because they are, but the middle ground, the people who are undecided. And I've had many conversations with university students, one-to-one or in small groups, of people who are not pro-Israel, not anti-Israel, and in some cases anti-Israel. And they can be educated and persuaded but you have to have the information and you have to be able to argue against their information. So that's the first thing I think is so important. And I know I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs, because you all know this anyway, but I thought it was worth emphasizing. And secondly, if possible, if you as a student or your children or whatever as students get involved in Israeli societies or Jewish societies at university, then for goodness sake, do your best to enlist non-Jews into the cause as well, because there are obviously going to be more of them, and their voices are going to be important. And there are plenty, particularly not all, but quite a lot of Christians who are willing to stick up for Israel if someone persuades them to or asks them to. And I think that's extremely important. Now, I've banged on far too long. I did say to the rabbi over 20 minutes. I think it's probably about 25 minutes. So I really apologize. I'm very happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. That was really insightful. I think obviously the first question is the one you said we should ask, which is what do you think the military actions could be that would decisively, change the landscape in Gaza definitively?
Well, I think it's a hard solution, and it's one that many people over here in the past and now believe that Israel should do, and many other people in the UK I've spoken to believe it as well, which is that they should not just attack from the air, they should go in on the ground and they should annihilate Hamas. And they could do that. They could go and wipe out Hamas. Not necessarily every single member, but very large, the most significant parts, the leaders, the significant followers, and they could do that. But then they would own Gaza. They would run Gaza. They'd have to run Gaza, because if Hamas isn't running Gaza, no one else is going to do it. The UN isn't going to do it. Qatar is not going to do it. Saudi is not. No other country is going to do that. So it's then Israel's problem, and that brings with it massive issues. First of all, maybe least of all, but nevertheless, first for me to mention is the huge financial commitment it would require, and it would require a very, very large financial commitment to run Gaza as a Israel couldn't let Gaza carry on running as it is now. If it was in control, it would have to dramatically improve the way of life there. Secondly, it would require huge military resources, and those military resources are already quite well stretched in Israel, and in particular, they are needed for a future conflict with Iran, which is almost inevitable. And it's not just keeping them in reserve just in case it happens, it's keeping them prepared, training them, air elements, ground elements, training them for that fight when it comes. And the decision has to be taken by the Israeli Prime Minister and Security Cabinet. Am I prepared to invest all those military resources in Gaza, which would deny me the opportunity to use them when needed against Iran, or indeed some other enemy, most likely Iran. So those are the issues with it. And I don't say it's the right thing to do. I think it's a thing to do. I do think that it's not for me to say, nor for the US or anyone else. It's for Israel to decide that, whether they should do it or not. And of course, the other factor, which is also important, is it would attract huge opprobrium from the international community. If they think now that they're getting a hard time from the international community, this would be much, much worse. And in addition to all of that, quite a few Israeli soldiers would die in that conflict. So all those things are obviously balanced by the Prime Minister, and he has decided in this conflict and previous conflicts not to go down that route.
Thank you very much. Guys, you can send in questions in the chat. I'll try and ask every question as it comes in. A question is your view shared by other top military and ex-military people in Europe? And if so, why do we not hear from them in the media?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I speak quite a lot, as I was in the British Army, as I mentioned, 30 years, and I still have many friends and contacts who served with me or who I still keep in touch with today, still serving. And with very few exceptions, military, British Army, Navy, Air Force people I speak to share my views, serving and retired. They have the same view as I do. They have great admiration for the IDF and what it does. Why is that different from maybe quite a lot of the non-military population in the UK? It's because they fought the same enemy as Israel fights. They've used the same methods. They've employed the same tactics. They understand what Israel's doing. Whereas someone who watches the BBC, they get completely the wrong impression and they don't really understand it anyway. Whereas these people do. I think the same opinion probably applies in most European forces. Why they don't speak up, it's not hard to understand why they don't speak up, because if you whether you're military or not military, if you say anything either neutral or good about Israel or the IDF, you are vilified. You're a target of attack. I have been subject to enormous amount of anti-Semitic abuse, although I'm not Jewish. I've been accused of being a stooge for the Zionist entity. I've been told I'm getting paid massive amounts of money by Mossad. Wish I was, but I'm not. You know, I've been called Islamophobic. I've been called racist. I've been branded in every way. I've had abusive things said about my children. And who wants that, to be honest? Who does want that? And most people don't want it, understandably. And the second thing, you know, most people who have served in the forces, they fought quite a lot. They don't necessarily want to retire and keep fighting. And another issue I think that applies to many is many people after they leave the armed forces work in the security world naturally, and many security contracts for British companies come from the Middle East, from countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Jordan, and so on. And they're lucrative contracts. And they're afraid, and I think they're out of date now in the same way as the Foreign Office is out of date with its appraisal of Arab attitudes towards Israel. But they're afraid, of course, that they won't get those contracts if they stick up for Israel. And I've been on the wrong side of that as well. I've been asked to do security-related work for Middle Eastern countries, and the countries themselves have never objected to it. But when the British companies that have asked me to be consulting for them, which some have, when they actually then look into me and realise that my public standing on Israel, they will get cold feet and say, well, thank you, but we don't think you're quite the right person now. And that is someone's livelihood being taken away like that. So I think, you know, unless, I've known, there's a few I know who will speak up, but it's not a healthy thing to do. And if you don't really understand why you have a dog in the fight, then why would you?
Thank you very much. Do you think there's a silent majority in England or in the UK who are neutral and sympathetic to Israel? And if so, how do we galvanize them?
I believe, and I've got no scientific basis whatsoever for this, but I believe that the majority of ordinary, decent British people are not opposed to Israel. Some of them, of course, are influenced by the BBC and other media propaganda, the United Nations, the EU, university professors, in an alarmingly greater number in relation to universities and school teachers at high schools. But I think the majority of ordinary, decent British people who are not tainted by that kind of propaganda, not only are not anti-Israel, many of them very pro-Israel, many of them think that Israel shows courage in sticking up for its country and for its people and taking decisive action. Now, I couldn't tell you if that's a majority. I wouldn't be surprised if that is not the majority, because the people we hear from typically are those people who are in the media, or those people who want to be vocal and in an anti-Israel way. So they're activists. They're not the majority. There are a small number of people who make a lot of noise. And of course, many university professors, many academics. And in terms of how you go about galvanizing that view towards Israel, I think it's very hard. I mentioned, I think, you know, university students should try and enlist people who are not anti-Israel, who are not Jews, to the cause. It's not going to be easy. The majority of people really, you know, they want to go down the pub, they want to watch Netflix, or they want to play computer games or whatever it is. They're not really interested in political issues. So it is hard to galvanize. I think the most important thing is for those of us who are in a position to do so, to try and influence journalists. And it's not easy, because whatever, even the personal view of journalists is often overridden by the editorial policy of their publication or their media outlet. And politicians, and politicians are much more, I think, susceptible to influence than journalists will be. But again, it's not easy, and it requires, I think, significant lobbying of politicians by organized groups, if possible, to persuade them to actually speak up and speak out and use their influence. And I think, another area, again, that it's not something individuals can necessarily do, but identifying those people who are rising stars in perhaps the civil service, in politics, and in the media, the younger people who could be influenced by some form of informal education. And just one example of that is, I've forgotten the name of the organization. You will know what it is. It's JCOM, I think it's called. Is it JCOM? It's basically a British media organization that tries to influence. BICOM, sorry, BICOM. That's the one. BICOM. They bring British journalists out here to see Israel for themselves, and that has quite a good effect in some cases. I've known journalists. In fact, I was out here just yesterday. There was a journalist out here who had been done a trip with BICOM, who I think otherwise might not have been particularly good on Israel, is now actually very good on Israel. So yeah, I mean, it's no real easy answers to that.
The question that's been asked so far 4 times is, why did Hezbollah not involve themselves in this conflict, and what is their game plan?
Well, we have to understand what Hezbollah is there, what they are, and what they're there for. And the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Hezbollah missile capability in Lebanon is obviously organized. Hezbollah was created by Iran, and Hezbollah in Lebanon is funded by Iran. They are armed by Iran. All of that stuff is Iranian weaponry under Iranian command, effectively. And it exists for one reason, and one reason only. And that reason is, if Israel attacks Iran, let's say it carries out a significant strike against Iranian nuclear facilities, or the US does, those missiles are waiting to be unleashed on Israel in retaliation. And they're also there as a deterrent, because of course Israel knows that's what they're there for, and they're very powerful. I don't believe personally they would deter Israel from attacking if it decided it needed to do so. And the Israeli Defense Force has a plan to deal with those missiles. It wouldn't be pretty. It wouldn't be pretty on either side. There'd be a lot of blood spilled on both sides. But that's what they're there for. So they're not going to use them. If they use them in any, maybe the odd 1 or 2 fire, but if they use them in any significant way, they will be annihilated by the IDF. They will be. It will, as I said, it won't be pretty. But they don't want to waste those missiles unless there's an imminent attack by Israel on Iran, or they've already attacked Iran. So that's what that's all about. But of course, Hezbollah is much bigger than that. Hezbollah has been fighting in Syria, has been responsible to quite a large extent for propping up the Assad regime. Hezbollah launches operations around the world on the orders of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, whose leader, Qasem Soleimani, was tragically subject to a missile accident in Iraq not long ago. And that includes, in 2015, the Hezbollah, under IRGC orders, set up a bomb factory in London, tried to manufacture bombs in London to carry out a bombing offensive in Britain. That was stopped by British intelligence and the police in 2015 as a result of intelligence provided to Britain by Israel. So, they've got much wider interest, but the question was really, I think, about the missiles in southern Lebanon, and that's why they haven't used them.
Which brings to the next question. The war or the fight with Iran, which, you said if we got involved in Gaza more would be inevitable. Is that a war that Israel fights alone? Or does the US and UK join in, or just the US join in that war?
Just before I come to answer that, is that, as you know, Israel has mounted a very effective campaign, military oblique espionage, sabotage campaign against the Iranian nuclear facility for some time. There was a Stuxnet virus which did severe damage to the Iranian nuclear program. And that was a joint venture by Israel and the US with UK input as well. The UK was involved in that. They won't admit it, but they were. It's a secret, by the way, so only tell a few close friends about that one. And we've seen, we saw the extraordinary operation by Mossad a few years back to go into Tehran and seize the nuclear archive, which was hugely damaging for Iran, not depriving them of information. That was a problem, but it wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem was discrediting Iran in the eyes of the US administration at the time and the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Authority. Unfortunately, they were too enthusiastic about sticking to the Iranian nuclear deal, so it didn't have a major effect, but it could have done. And then, of course, the assassination of one of the leading Iranian nuclear scientists, numerous other sabotage attacks that have taken place that have set back the program. So these things have been happening, and they've been happening in some cases with the assistance of the US. And I mentioned British involvement in Stuxnet, but also I would say, and I'm not saying this on the basis of any inside information, but I would guess that the UK have also provided some assistance to Israel in some of the other aspects of that campaign. When it comes to a full-blown conflict, if Israel, let's say, has to do what it did to the Iraqi and the Syrian nuclear programs, i.e. carry out bombing raids against them a few years ago, I would guess the likelihood Israel will be doing that alone, and possibly without backing from the US, which would be difficult for them. And when I say difficult, I don't mean difficult technically or militarily, but difficult in terms of political aspects. So I think it would be. It depends on who the US president is at the time, but it may be that the US are directly involved as well, possibly. I'd like to think Britain would be as well, but I don't have much confidence that Britain. I think if Israeli Defense Force and US Air Force planes go in and do some severe bombing in Iran, I believe the Royal Air Force should be flying alongside them. As I believe if they have to go and deal with the Hamas missile, the Hezbollah missiles in Lebanon, that the Royal Air Force should be flying with them in that. They won't be, but I think they should be, because it's also our fight. It's not just, and particularly the Iranian nuclear issue is not just Israel's fight, it's the world's fight.
Thank you very much. What do you see the security risks, or how does it all look if Hamas manages to take over the West Bank?
I think that is, first of all, I think it's a distinct possibility that will happen. I think it's almost inevitable that will happen. And that will, and of course, Israel knows that as well and is preparing for that eventuality. They have plans in place to deal with that situation if it occurs, or maybe I should say when it occurs. It will be a really big problem. And the problems that exist now in the West Bank, I think, will be multiplied time and time over. But Israel will contain that. Israel has the military capability to contain it. It's not going to be pleasant on either side, but Israel will contain that. And what it will mean for sure is that there can't be any greater independence. I think ideally, in my view, the Palestinians could be given greater authority in Judea and in areas A and B in Judea and Samaria, and should be given greater authority if it gets to a point where it's possible, where there is sufficient accommodation between the two sides. But it couldn't happen if there was Hamas in charge. It just couldn't happen. They would almost certainly have pretty much all their existing authority denied of them. I would have thought Oslo is going to, in as much as it hasn't already, is likely to collapse. So it would be a very difficult situation. Like I said, much worse than we have at the moment. And that's why, and of course, when it happens, Israel is to blame. And when Israel deals with it, Israel is illegal occupiers, Israel's illegal settlers, they are illegally dealing with these Palestinians. That's the way it'll be dealt with, and it'll be hugely problematic for Israel on the political side. And it's why that our government and the US government and other governments should actually be taking a very different approach, I think, to trying to ensure that does not come about. And the best way to ensure it doesn't come about is for Abbas to go and for him to be replaced by somebody who has a more pragmatic and reasonable approach to the problem.
Thank you. The new US administration versus, or as it is distinct from the old one, how do you see that in assisting prospects for peace or otherwise?
I feel that, I mean, I think that the US was very staunch in its support of Israel in the last conflict, in this conflict that's just finished. Some people were surprised by that. They thought that the US administration now would be less supportive of Israel, but I think they have been pretty good. Better than the British government, I have to say, although it's obviously a different position. But I think that, you know, because the Biden administration is staffed to a large extent by the foreign affairs and the Middle East portfolios by the same people, or many of the same people as were working with President Obama on this issue, they are locked into the kind of Kerry peace processing mindset where it's, you know, there will be no separate peace with Israel until the Palestinians make peace. There'll be no separate peace with Arab countries. And then he was proved wrong, but they don't accept they were wrong, really. And one of the earlier actions of the Biden administration was to restore, to a considerable extent, relations between the Palestinian Authority and the US, and continue giving them the aid that is used to a large extent to incite terrorism and to pay the salaries or the pensions of terrorists who have killed Israelis. And that is the wrong approach, in my opinion. The approach, you know, in the Middle East, there's a kind of a Western view that if you're nice to people, if you give them what they want, what they ask for, they'll be nice back to you, but it isn't where it works over here. If you give them something, they'll take it and want more and not do anything for it. In many cases, certainly among the Palestinian Authority, that's what the case is. They were beginning to feel quite badly isolated as a result of the Abraham Accords. And I believe that capital could have been made by that isolation by retaining a hard line on them, as the previous US administration did. I think to give them a get out of jail card, as the current administration has done, is going to reduce that sense of isolation, which, okay, we don't want to see people isolated, but we do want to see them isolated if that will force them to come to some kind of accommodation, which they haven't done. You know, they simply haven't done. They haven't compromised. They haven't accepted any peace proposals, any solutions of any sort in their entire time, with the exception of the Oslo agreements, which really didn't, in my view, get too far. So I think, I don't think that the Biden administration's current policies on the Middle East, and indeed other places in the world, they're not, I don't believe, conducive to bringing about or advancing in any way the cause of peace, difficult though it is, whatever policies you use.
We're going on past the hour, so just it's already 11 o'clock for you. So just
Rabbi, whenever you want, you tell me when to shut up, and I'll talk until you do.
It's really great, but I don't want to keep you for too long. So just one or two more questions. The first is that you've spoken about all the negative press that one gets, both on their personal but also in their public life, if you support Israel in the UK or in many Western countries. So why are you different? What made you fall in love with the country? They say a real friend is somebody who's there for you in need. And I think, you know, I get the feeling in a very strong way that it's a time of need and you're here and giving up your time to be able to do this. So what was the trigger that made you fall in love with this country?
I think I'm a bit weird, Rabbi, to tell you the truth.
What made you
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned it at the beginning. I was taught right from wrong, and I was also taught by my parents that if I was in a position where I could put the wrong right or help put the wrong right, I have a duty to do that, whatever it is. If it's walking down the street and seeing some old lady getting beaten up by a bunch of kids, it's my job to go and get stuck into that, not to walk by and ignore it. And oh, okay, this is a completely different level, but when I was in the army, I was not allowed, and no serving officer or soldier is allowed to speak out on political issues. And so I couldn't do that as a serving officer, much as I would have liked to do so, but I couldn't, and it's for very good reason. But when I left, after I left the army, I built up a media platform, mainly talking about Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and other military intelligence terrorism issues. And I've had a lot of experience of fighting this type of fight, so I knew what I was talking about. So I was able to have some kind of influence. Now, I don't overestimate my personal influence; it's minimal, but that's not the point. I mean, I do what I can do, and I was able to do that, and I therefore had a duty to do it. It's simple as that. I also have huge admiration for Israel. My father actually, he never went to Israel. I don't know if he ever met a Jew, but he was very, very strong supporter of Israel. And when it didn't come up very often in my household, but when it did come up, when the subject came up, I was in no doubt about where his side was on this issue. And of course, that will have influenced anybody, I think. But also, during my service, in the last few years of my service, I was working in the Prime Minister's office and in the Cabinet office in London. And I was working on international terrorism. And of course, some of our most important partners in that world, it was intelligence stuff, were Israelis. And so I worked closely with Mossad, with the Israeli military intelligence, with other Israeli intelligence organizations, to our mutual benefit. And I saw the benefit of that Israel provided to us. Just a couple of quick examples for you. On the July the 7th, 2005, when we had the bomb attacks in London and the underground and on the bus, I was the chairman of the Cobra Intelligence Group. Cobra is the National Crisis Management Committee, and I was chairing the group that provides intelligence support for that, which is basically made up of MI5, MI6, GCHQ, defense intelligence, etc., and police. And the attacks happened at 10 to 8 in the morning, and Cobra then convened at, I think it was just after 8 o'clock, just with the cabinet around the table, to be briefed and make decisions as to how to handle this unfolding nightmare. Now, I received a phone call just before Cobra met from the head of the Mossad station in London, and he said to me, anything you want, any assistance you need, any assets you require, any resources you want, anything you want, pick the phone up, tell me, and it will be produced. Because as at this moment, Mossad's #1 priority is supporting the UK over this crisis. Now those are the words of a true friend, and I know he meant it. And the second example was when I was in 2003, so a couple of years before, I was sent out from that same job I had at the time. I came back to it later. I was sent out to Afghanistan to become Commander of British Forces there in 2003. And it was the first time in my career I'd faced the threat, or my soldiers had faced the threat of suicide terrorism. We dealt with every other kind of terrorism, Irish particularly, but never suicide terrorism. So we didn't really know what we should do about it. And my first immediate thought was, I know who deals with this most effectively, Israel. So I said to the head of the Mossad station in London, could you get the defense attaché from the Israeli embassy to come and talk to me about how the Israelis deal with it before I go out to Afghanistan? And he said, no, I'm not doing that. Oh, a bit miserable of you. You know, I've bought you many coffees. I've given you much intelligence I shouldn't have done. And you won't even do that. He said, no, I'm going to do better than that. And he sent to the Golan Heights for a brigadier general who was commanding a division in the Golan Heights, who was deemed to be the IDF's #1 expert in dealing with suicide bomb attacks. He brought him over 2 days later, and he and I sat in the hotel lobby in London, where he briefed me for several hours on the Israeli procedures. I wrote it all down, and I converted that into the British Army's policy for dealing with suicide bomb attacks. Now, that policy is still in use today. It's also been adopted by NATO countries, and it has saved many British and Allied soldiers' lives. And they didn't need to do that. They could have given me the defense attaché who would have known about it, but not as much. But they went all the way. We've had many British lives have been saved by Israeli intelligence, Israeli troop, but that's fighting troops, and also back home in the UK. I've mentioned the IRGC bomb factory. and Israeli battlefield medical technology, Israeli counter bomb technology, drone technology. We benefit from all of that, as well as intelligence. And so, you know, these are things that I have witnessed personally, and they make a big impact on you if you do. And that, I think, helped motivate me to use the platform I had to do what I thought was right, and stick up for a country that is a close ally of ours and is also fighting the same fight as we're fighting, but they're fighting it right at the front line all of the time.
And we thank you for it. It's the way you present yourself, and it makes every Jew proud that we have somebody like you on our side. So thank you very, very much on behalf of myself and the entire community. Richard, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for answering all the questions. Thank you for staying up so late. And from everyone, can give you a round of applause, but I can't unmute anyone because I've pre-done it. So thank you. And I'll send you some of the messages that people sent me in the chat, just personal thank yous, not questions. And I'll email them to you afterwards. So thank you everybody for joining, and thank you, Richard, so much for your generosity with your time this evening. Have a great, great night, and we'll see you when you come back. You definitely come and visit us. We'd love to do a Shabbat, and we have a little yeshiva you can learn in as well.
I can teach in it.
You can teach, you can get, exactly.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for listening.
God bless you all. Good night.